All right, thanks for the intro, Steve. All of the slides and links for this presentation are available now. So if you see a long link in the talk, just go to this short URL and click on it. Some really brief information about me. Like Steve said, I work at Etsy on the performance team there. I also write the site performance reports. So if you were in Seth Walker's talk yesterday, for the past year or so, I've been authoring those reports on our blog. I organize the Boston Web Performance Meetup group as well. So if you happen to be in Boston or in the Northeast, anywhere, you can come check that out. Some quick stats about Etsy. We're the world's largest handmade marketplace. We get about 1.5 billion page views per month. And we did about $1 billion in sales last year. Now, this is cool, but the more important thing is we care a lot about performance. And we published some data recently that showed by adding 160 kilobytes to a page on mobile, we saw a 12% increase in bounce rate. So we now have some real data from our own customers, our own site, and recent data as well. And we think about this every day when we build our tools to make our performance better. And today I'm going to talk about one of the tools that we use to monitor performance. Before we get into that, I have to give a little bit of background on synthetic monitoring. When people talk about synthetic, they usually compare it to rum. These are sort of two sides of the coin when it comes to monitoring, and they both have their strengths and weaknesses. On the synthetic side, we have browser instrumentation. So for WebPagetest, there's an agent that actually drives real versions of Chrome, IE, Firefox, etc. And with that instrumentation, you can get more data than you would get from a real browser. On the real browser side, we have the navigation timing API, which is great, but it does have limited ability to give you information about what's actually going on in the user's browser. So you can get more data from a synthetic tool. Synthetic also tends to be a little more consistent over time. Because of the network characteristics in real user browsers and real user devices, it can be variable depending on where users are located, what devices they're on, etc. Similarly, on the synthetic side, it's largely in your control. Because the network portion of it is taken out, and if you were in Pat's talk on Monday, he mentioned this as well, a lot of the synthetic nodes tend to be in data centers right next to CDN POPs on the backbone of the internet. So that network variability is largely taken out of synthetic monitoring. This is a plus because it's in your control. It's a negative because it's a little bit less realistic. On the real user side, we have these last mile problems. Because of the end user connectivity from their individual device to the local cell tower or data center, whatever it may be, that adds a lot of variability to those metrics. This means that synthetic is great for detecting regressions or changes in the performance of your page, and real user monitoring is great for comparing users across geographies, across different browsers, and seeing what's going on in real life. And again, that brings us back to this point that synthetic is not super realistic, but it's great for trending, and real user monitoring is called real user monitoring for a reason. When it comes to synthetic monitoring, as we've seen, there are some really big benefits to using it. So how do we do it effectively? There are a ton of companies that will do this for you. There's a bunch of commercial products out there. Again, Pat talked about some of these as well. And they all have great products, but one of the downsides is they do end up costing a lot of money. And more importantly, every time you want to add a test or add a location or increase frequency, you end up paying a little bit more. And that's part of the model, right? As you want to test more, as you like the data, you end up spending more money. So at this point, people tend to turn to private WebPagetest because it's a free way to install a service that will do somewhat of the same thing without spending a ton of money. How many people here are running a private instance today? Okay, maybe 10, a dozen? So if you are, I want to show you some techniques and some tools that we're open sourcing that are going to help you make better use of that infrastructure. And if you're not using one, which the majority of you are not, hopefully I'll provide a compelling case for trying to set one up. First, a little bit of background about the tool itself. We've heard a lot about this from Pat. I want to talk more about the actual code behind it. So this is all on GitHub. This is a pretty recent move from Google Code, but now it's in this WPO Foundation project on GitHub. And everything is open. The issues are closed very quickly with real solutions. Pat's extremely responsive to any changes you have. So it's a great resource. There's also forums. There's a specific forum on webpagetest.org that's tailored to private instances. So if you have any questions or problems with your instance, again, Pat's really on the ball about replying to those questions. There's also a really robust set of documentation. This covers everything from configuration to setup to test agents, and it's a great way to figure out how to get this stuff up and running. There's also frequent releases. So you can see here the latest release is 2.12. These come out fairly often, but not too often that it's a pain to upgrade all the time. And I mentioned the agents a little bit. One of the benefits of WebPagetest is that Pat has created EC2 test agents. And this means these are public AMIs that you can just go on EC2, simply search for the AMI, and then install an agent with very, very little work. So basically all you do is click on the image you want, configure a little bit of test data in the agent itself, and then you have it up and running. This is what our EC2 account looks like. We have 3 different agents. So you can see one is running IE8, and there's 2 agents that are running the more modern browsers. We have 2 of them because we run a lot of tests, so it just allows us to get more throughput by having multiple agents. And then you see the WebPagetest server there as well. So we just have 4 simple instances. The server itself is very, very small, and then we have mediums for the 2 bigger agents, and then a small instance for the IE8 agent. This all works very, very well, and it's easy to set up, but unfortunately, out of the box, WebPagetest has no built-in automation. What this means is that when you run a lot of tests, the standard output looks like this. It's essentially a log file. And this is great, and it allows you to drill into the data by hand, but it's not an automated process. What you really want to get out of this is something like this, where you have an array of graphs, maybe broken out by browser, by page, etc. This is what brings us to WPTScript, which is a tool that Etsy open sourced this morning. And essentially what it is it's a wrapper around the WebPagetest API that allows you to automatically generate tests and automatically aggregate results. As I mentioned, this is on GitHub right now, so if you go to github.com/etsy/WPTScript, you'll see this today. So what is the motivation for this? I've talked a little bit about it, but we have a few core reasons why we wanted to build this tool. First of all, we wanted this long-term synthetic trending. We wanted to be able to say, I want to see how our performance is changing over time. We want to be able to detect regressions, detect changes in our load time, and do this all in an automated fashion. Which brings us to automated testing. We want to be able to kick these tests off on a regular basis via a cron job or something similar, so we don't have to do this manually. We also wanted a little bit more control, things like adding tests, removing them, changing nodes, moving the nodes around. We wanted control over that without incurring a cost every time we change something. And that brings us to the last point, which is the fact that it is low cost. Those agents themselves on the EC2, on our EC2 account, that's pretty much the only cost we incur for running these tests. To make WPTScript easy to use, we wanted to make the configuration as simple as possible. So the configuration is all done through JSON files. This is a pretty simple example, and I'm going to walk through it to show you exactly what's going on here. The first element in the JSON object is just the URL to the server that's actually running WebPagetest itself. So WPTScript by itself is just a set of PHP scripts. This can live on any box. It can live on your laptop. It can live on a machine in a data center. It doesn't actually matter. All this tool is doing is curling out to the URL that you specify and querying the WebPagetest API. So likewise, you could use WPTScript to actually hit the public instance of WebPagetest as well. Because that API is public, you can run tests on any existing WebPagetest install anywhere it may be. You can configure the locations easily, just setting up what browsers you want it to run on, and as long as these locations exist and there's agents to fulfill the tests, that'll work great. Then obviously you specify a set of URLs, so you give it a label, and then the URL that you actually want to request. And then finally, the section at the bottom is for results, gathering results. In our case, we gather results both on Graphite and in Splunk. So this is our just Graphite server. This is an example that you could set up. We have a logging namespace, so all of the WebPagetest results go into a specific namespace in Graphite. And then we also have a Splunk log file that gets shipped off to Splunk, and the data gets aggregated there. Once you have this configuration file, running it is very, very simple. You just set up a simple cron job to run this PHP script. By default, it's going to look for a configuration file called default.conf in the directory, but you can pass a configuration file if you want to run multiple configurations or just a different thing from the default. And then we just set up a second job to get the results. And these are separate primarily because we run, for example, like 5 or 6 different configurations or maybe even a dozen, and then you get results, and it gets results for all of those different configurations and sends them off to the graphing tools that you've added to your install. So that's the basic version, and this is nice, but at its very high level, all it's really doing is setting up some tests and getting some results. We also built in some advanced features to get a little bit more out of the tool. One of the things that we do, and this is optional, but it's something we do on almost all of our tests, is we log in to Etsy.com with the test itself. So WebPagetest, as Pat talked about earlier today, has an extremely robust scripting engine, and with that scripting engine, we can log in to our site. So we actually put our this prepend login keyword, and then we just put the username and password in the config file, so it will log into Etsy.com. That prepend element is also important because you can pass an array of things to it. And this may look a little weird. We've got this block third-party thing, and then there's this bypass CDN.txt. What's going on here behind the scenes is that in the PHP, we actually say, look for a file. If a file exists on disk that matches what you've put in prepend, then go grab that file and we'll call that a script. Otherwise, let's look for a method on this class and see if we can just run that method. So if we go back a slide, you'll see this block third party is going to be a method that's just existing on the class to block our third party content and see how that impacts performance. And that bypass cdn.text is a text file that contains a simple WebPageTest script. So to show that, this might be what bypass cdn.text would look like. It's the standard WebPageTest scripting language, so everything that's documented and everything you can do on the public webpagetest.org, but you can put any script you want in here and it will get automatically sucked up and run as part of that test. Once you have all these tests running, you need to gather the results. This example right here, just real quick, basically what we're doing here is redirecting all of our static content domains, so CSS, JavaScript, and images, to our origin domains. So this is bypassing our CDNs, and we can compare the impact of performance that our CDN has. So this is just a simple example of us saying, let's look at a test with our CDN and a test without our CDN and see how they compare. This is the kind of thing you can do pretty easily with this tool, or with WebPagetest in general. So again, we have to get to gathering the results. This is something that, as I mentioned, we do this with Splunk and Graphite, but it's very, very easy to add any consumer of this data that you want. This is really all the code that exists to gather the results. So there's a Splunk logger, loop over the results, and log them to Splunk. We have a Graphite logger, and you can graph those through Graphite. These are the things that exist today in the open source project. So if you do happen to use Splunk or Graphite, it's going to be super, super simple to set it up. But if you have a different tool that you want to send data to, go ahead and add that. Send us a pull request. We'll be happy to add it, or just add it on your own. And since the results are simply coming back from this pull request to WebPageTest, it's very simple to get them into any output method you want. So when it comes to Splunk, this is kind of what it looks like. We have this aggregate data. It's a little hard to read, but you can see here a bunch of our competitors and some of our own pages, and we aggregate the data up into these roll-up numbers. Usually what we do with this data is we take it and have one of our designers build it into a nice graphic for one of our performance posts. So this is one of the ways we consume the data, is putting this into our site performance reports and comparing over time how performance has changed based on our WebPageTest metrics. We also put it into Graphite, and the Graphite results can look like this. So this is a simple example of IE9 for 5 major pages across a 24-hour period, graphing start render time. And you can see it gets a little bit spiky at times, but overall it's pretty consistent. This is kind of what we were looking for in the beginning, right? We have WebPageTest. It's running a bunch of tests. We've gotten all the results, and we're trending those results over time. It's also important to note that we can graph any metric that WebPageTest reports. This is an example from the documentation directly in WebPageTest. Things like load time, fully loaded, speed index, which we've heard a lot about today, DOM elements, first byte. And this is actually just a subset. There's a lot more metrics that WebPageTest reports, and you can also graph those. Things like bytes downloaded, the scores for different WebPageTest metrics that it looks at. So if you look at the web interface, you'll see A for use of CDN or compressing text, et cetera. Those scores are reported as numerical values in the output, so you can graph those however you want. Here's an example of that. So we just simply graph these things. This is document complete with a couple different pages, a couple different browsers. On this graph, you'll see that dotted red line. That's actually our SLA. And you can see both the IE8 examples are above it, but the Chrome example and the IE9 example tend to be more or less below it. So even though we might not totally meet our SLA every single request, WebPagetest gives us a great way to see if that's happening. The final way we consume this data is through a weekly report. This is one of the graphs that comes in the report, but basically we graph week over week all the changes for every single metric that WebPagetest reports to us. So this is just an example of DOM elements. The median here is a little irrelevant because hopefully it's not going to change a whole lot on a day-to-day basis. But this is an extremely easy way for us to see, has the page changed on a significant basis? So let's say something like document complete has changed a lot, or start render. We may scroll down the report and see that, you know what, DOM elements went from 1,100 up to 2,000. So obviously some feature was released that changed the topology of the page and changed the DOM, and that could explain why performance has suffered. So having all of this rolled up into an aggregate fashion makes it really easy for us to detect regressions. The other thing we've done with this tool is we put it into our admin toolbar. This is a toolbar that persists across Etsy.com for all employees in development and production. There's a bunch of tools hidden in here. You can see a lot of them on this slide. But we have a button here that just says WebPageTest. And what this does is when a user clicks on it, it just simply kicks off a test for that URL on our private instance of WebPageTest. So this is just one of the ways we try to expose this tool and get more adoption across the company. All right, so this is a pretty nice tool, but it does have some disadvantages versus the existing paid options out there. For one, it's a little bit harder to set up and maintain. You have to do some manual work. Again, it's not complicated, but it's harder than signing a contract and clicking a few buttons. The functionality that it has is limited to what WebPageTest itself has. And in a lot of cases, WebPageTest has much more functionality than some of the paid tools. But there are certain things that I think paid tools do a bit better. And that's primarily because paid tools are optimizing for trending over time, because they're designed to do that. WebPageTest is fairly optimized for single-page views or scripted tests, but not necessarily graphing those things over time. A specific example of this might be, so we're Catchpoint customers, and Catchpoint is able to scrape the page and pull data out of the HTML or pull data out of the response headers, and then graph that alongside WebPageTest, or sorry, alongside the other metrics that it pulls out. Although I was talking to Steve earlier today, and apparently that's part of WebPageTest as well. So I'll have to talk to Pat about that after the talk. Another disadvantage is regions. Because this is EC2, you can in fact set up an agent in whatever region you want. So anywhere EC2 has agents, or wherever you happen to be deploying these agents, you can set them up. But it's more work, right? You have to spin up a VM and create this region in order to have agents that are from that region. Whereas in a paid tool, it's basically just checking a box. So I think that's a small disadvantage with this tool itself. And as I mentioned before, it's a little more full-page oriented. So if you're doing DNS requests or you want to check the performance of a single image, that's something that a synthetic paid tool is probably a little bit better at right now. And then finally, it's a little less consistent. This is not the fault of WebPageTest. This is the fault of the fact that we're on EC2 on small instances. And it's fairly well known that if you're on micro or small instances on EC2, you can get some noisy neighbor effects, and it can be a little bit dicey to get that consistency that you might want. So these are the disadvantages, but there are some very significant advantages versus paid tools as well. The obvious one is cost. It's going to be a lot cheaper to run your own EC2 instances versus paying for a synthetic tool. This also gives you some flexibility. Like I said, if you want to add a region or add a page to test or simply increase frequency, that's something that's very, very simple to do and doesn't cost you anything extra. Because you're paying for those instances to be up, however much you use them is irrelevant. As long as you have the disk space and the CPU to actually run the tests, you're not going to pay any extra to run more tests. I think another advantage is that people tend to know the tool. Most people here are familiar with WebPageTest. Anyone on your performance team is going to be familiar with it. It's got great documentation. It's all public in the open. So it's very, very easy for people to learn and use the tool. And then I think the other benefits are between multi-page flows and scripting. These are the kind of things that if you start doing scripting or hitting a bunch of pages or doing a checkout flow with a paid tool, that gets very expensive and it can be hard to set up. You have to learn the scripting language of that tool. Whereas with WebPageTest, you may already know the language, and again, it doesn't cost you any extra to do these advanced features. So I mentioned we're Catchpoint customers. What are our use cases? We have both a private instance of WebPageTest and we use Catchpoint. On the WebPageTest side, like I said, multi-page flows and scripted tests are two of the big things we use it for. We use it for high volume testing. If we want to test a ton of pages in a very, very short intervals, that's a great use case for this. We also use it for ad hoc tests. On the paid side, you typically have a contract for a certain number of points or a certain number of tests over a given period, maybe monthly. This makes ad hoc tests a little complicated because if I want to, let's say I'm launching a new version of our homepage and we want to test the old version versus the new version. We want to do this pretty often from a bunch of different locations. If I just added that on the fly, I might get overage charges. I might have to just pay more. It might have to renegotiate a contract. That's a little bit complicated. If you have your own instance, these ad hoc tests become very simple. There's basically no cost to doing them. On the Catchpoint side, we use it pretty heavily for DNS requests, API requests, and single object tests. These are all examples of things that I think Catchpoint optimizes for a little bit better. Because they're single requests, we're not getting waterfalls. We're just sort of wanting to request a single thing. It's very easy for us to check off a bunch of different locations, run them pretty often, and it is pretty inexpensive to do that. Speaking of locations, that's something else we use Catchpoint for. Because it's as simple as checking a box to get more locations, if we want to test from around the world, we tend to use Catchpoint for that instead of WebPageTest. Right now, as you saw, our agents are all in EC2 East. So we only have agents in US East for the private instance of WebPageTest, and any other locations around the world, we're going to use Catchpoint for that. And then finally, because of the noisiness of the data, I think Catchpoint's a little bit better for comparisons between two pages. Again, we can do this with WebPageTest, and we do it with WebPageTest, but if you really want stable metrics over time, having a dedicated service that's really focused on making those numbers be the same every single request is a little bit better. We also have some future work. We want to change some things about the tool and maybe improve some of the ways we do things. The first one is kind of operational. Right now, because that WebPageTest server is on a micro instance, we have very little disk space. And we have a cron job that cleans out old tests, but if we start adding more tests, then sometimes the disk fills up faster than the cron job can delete things. We have to tweak things. So we have run into some issues where just operationally, because we're running it ourselves, there's some extra work there. But that's something we could fix. It's just a question of spending the time to automate that kind of process. As I mentioned, the multiple regions issue is a little bit of a problem. It's not a problem for us because we just pay CachePoint to do that part of it, but it would be fairly easy to set up some automation to spin up regions for WebPagetest nodes. And we could write some tooling around that to make it simpler to bring up and bring down VMs in different EC2 regions and then hook that into our private install. I'd also like to see more canned scripts. And what I mean by canned scripts is you've probably seen or heard of this idea of the SPOF check on WebPagetest. That's an example of taking all of the third parties and sending them to this black hole server, which just drops all the traffic on the floor. And the idea here is, do you have a single point of failure on your front end, a third-party script that's blocking render, where if that third-party service goes down, your entire page is going to hang until it times out. So that's a great example of a canned script that's part of WebPagetest itself. It's simply a checkbox right now in the UI. I think it'd be great to have additional canned scripts, additional things that people are typically testing with, things they want to check on their site, whether that's blocking third parties, whether it's bypassing CDNs, things of that nature. And I think it'd be nice to have a repository of these example scripts so people could spin this instance up and really get some value out of it right away. Another thing is automatic upgrades. Right now, it's a manual process for us to upgrade WebPagetest, and I'd like to see, over time, us moving to a model where it's a little bit easier, maybe like a one-button upgrade when Pat releases a new version. I think we should also leverage the existing functionality in WebPagetest a little bit more than we already are. So I talked a minute ago about the front-end SPOF. So right now, we're not actually using that as part of our testing, but we certainly could. Like I learned today about a new feature in WebPagetest, there's always new things to learn. There's always new things being added. And I think this tool, because it has access to the full API, we can leverage any of those existing features that there are today. So we should think about more creative ways of leveraging all of the functionality that exists. Something else that's been talked about a bit at this conference is user timings. You can do performance.mark in your code, and then WebPagetest will draw that on the graph of the waterfall. It will also report that in the result set. So if we were to add user timings within our code, that simply gets reported out. It would be very easy for us to put that into Graphite. It's pretty much automated at this point. So I'd love to add some user timing metrics into our code and then have WPT script report on those and put those in Splunk and put those in Graphite. Again, this is a very, very simple way to leverage the existing functionality. And then finally, I think speed index is something that we could use a lot more. Excuse me. So speed index has been talked about a lot here. This is the 2-second version if you haven't seen it yet this conference. Basically, speed index is calculated as the area above the curve when you're looking at the curve of visibility over time for a page. When we look at document complete, if you read a recent report, it's starting to be a metric that means less in terms of actual business metrics. And we suspect that speed index is going to be a much better way to look at exactly what's impacting customer behavior. So we'd like to use this a little bit more than we already are today. And in fact, I think it's probably likely that we'll switch in our next report from reporting document complete to reporting speed index and seeing how that trends over time. Another thing that I think would be useful is to think about improving WebPagetest. So I recently moved from Google Code to GitHub, which I think is a big step forward. But I also wanted to make it even easier to get started with working on this product, adding features, fixing bugs, etc. So how many people here have used Vagrant? OK, that's like maybe 20% of the room. It's pretty good. So I made a Vagrant box yesterday to make it very, very easy to set up WebPagetest. So this process now is simply you just install VirtualBox, which many of you probably already have installed. Install Vagrant, which is maybe a 30-second process. Grab this gist off of GitHub. Type Vagrant up. And then you're going to have a running, fully functional WebPagetest instance on your local host. Now, when I say fully functional, that's a little bit of a lie because there's no agents actually running the tests. But in this VirtualBox image, there are some test results. So you can go play around with the code and see how everything looks in real life. So what does this gist look like? It's actually extremely simple. It's basically the simplest possible Vagrant configuration. Most of this file is actually comments. You can see towards the top there, you have that name. So I simply named the VirtualBox WebPagetest 2.12 or 2-12. This is the version of WebPagetest that the box is running. There's a URL there. That's to my Dropbox. It actually is, in fact, the VirtualBox image itself. And then we just forward the port at the bottom from the host, port 8080, to the guest, port 80. Now, don't do this now. That is an 800 megabyte VirtualBox image. If you all go to get this gist and type Vagrant up, we're going to put the conference Wi-Fi into the Hurt Locker really fast. So wait until you get home, and Vagrant will be smart enough to recognize, here's an image that I don't have yet, and it'll go download that for you, and then it'll spin up the VM automatically. So this is a nice feature of Vagrant, but if you do it on conference Wi-Fi, people are going to be pretty upset. But I did test it on the Wi-Fi yesterday, and it does work. So if you had slowness around 2 o'clock, that was probably me. How many of you have heard of WebPagetest API? Okay, like 3 people. Well, the 3 of you who've heard of it are probably saying to yourself, this sounds pretty similar to a WPT script. Well, it is. So WebPagetest API is a tool written by Marcel Duran. And it's a very, very similar tool. It just happens to be written in Node.js. It's a wrapper for the WebPagetest API. You can hit your own private instance, you can hit a public instance, and it has similar functionality. I'm not trying to say that you should use one over the other. If you happen to like Node.js, you should use WebPagetest API. If you happen to like PHP, you should use WPT script. They're both great options, and the point here is just to simply say, pick what works for you, and pick a project that you're willing to contribute to and hack on and make better. What I want you to take away from this is that results are better than tools. So whether you're using WPT script or WebPagetest API, or if you're using a third-party service that you're paying for, that's all great. Think about what works for your business and make sure that you're using what makes sense for you. The results you get out of these tools are much more important than the tools themselves. So just pick what works, contribute back to the project if you can, and let's all work together to make the web a little bit faster. Thanks. And I think we have time for questions. Steve. Yeah, so the question was, how often do people drill back to the individual test results? Unfortunately, never, because we have to delete them, because we don't have the disk space to store all of them right now. That's something that we'd like to change as well. We'd like to attach some S3 storage to the server itself and then store the results forever. But currently, we do delete the results and just store it in Graphite and Splunk. So it's currently impossible to drill down into it. We just have all the numbers and not the waterfalls themselves. Yeah, the question was, are we alerting on the data? We don't currently alert on it, but we do get reports. So it's kind of alerting. Like, we get emailed reports to the performance team, but it's like passive alerting. We don't get paged or anything like that. And we don't block our deploys. We don't have it in CI yet. I think it might be an interesting way to go at some point, but right now we do have intermittent spikes, and we don't want to get false positives. So something that we'll get emails about, and the performance team will investigate, and if there's a real problem, we'll see it, and we'll fix it. Sure. So the question was, what's the advantage of using a private instance versus the public one? So I guess you can use the public one with WPT script. It's easy to do. I would say that we're at a volume of testing where if we use the public API, Pat might come calling. So I think the real benefit is volume. If you want to run a lot of tests, then it's much easier to use a private install. But you're right. I mean, this tool works just as well with the public instance. If you're running only a few tests, just that server URL you saw in the config file, just change that to webpagetest.org, and everything will work. Inside the firewall, yeah. So if you want to test development sites or sites that aren't public, you can put this instance inside your firewall and get to that content. Yeah, the question was, does the wider engineering team use the tool a lot, or is it mostly performance? It's mostly performance, but if somebody's launching a new feature, we'll definitely encourage them to use it. And it's the kind of thing where we'll add additional testing and sort of do it on an ad hoc basis. But yeah, I think, as is the case in most places, if you have a performance team, people tend to expect the performance team to use the tooling, but it's available. And there are some teams that use it more than others. Single page apps. We haven't had to tackle single page apps. No, we don't. Yeah, we don't really do a whole lot of that. So it hasn't been an issue for us. Well, so single page apps, I mean, typically you have some sort of API that you're calling or some sort of endpoint. WebPagetest can test any publicly accessible endpoint, so you can still test that kind of thing. I mean, when it comes to the actual rendering process, that's something that WebPagetest isn't going to be as good at, but any URL is easy to get and test. Anything else? One in the back. The question was about EC2 and what size of machine. So the server itself is on a micro instance. The IE8 agent's on a small, and the 2 agents that run the modern browsers are on medium instances. Do we see a difference in performance from the small and medium? Not really. I mean, I think it's just a question of having the capacity to run all those browsers and just do a lot more testing. But yeah, we haven't seen any significant difference. But again, that's important. That's an important point because we don't take these numbers from WebPagetest on an absolute basis. It's a relative basis. We care much more about how it's trending over time. We're not looking at this and saying like, oh, our site loads in 7 seconds because that's what WebPagetest says. It's more of did this change versus yesterday versus last week. It's not so much about getting real numbers. So if there is a performance penalty for being on a smaller box, we actually don't care, as long as it's consistent. So are you running more agents to simulate concurrent users? We haven't done that yet. We basically just have the 3 agent boxes right now, and those are running pretty much at full tilt. So they're just constantly running tests all day, every day. But that's it right now, just the 3 agents. But you're right. I mean, you could use this to drive a botnet if you wanted to hit your own site or whatever. Here first. How are we centralizing all of it? We do it through Graphite and Splunk. So those are existing tools where we centralize all of our data about, basically all of our logs go into Splunk, and we put this into Splunk as well, and all of our performance data from the back end goes into Graphite. We put this into Graphite as well. Yeah, we bring it all in. Yeah, so it's all kind of in our internal tooling alongside everything else that we use. Yeah, so the deck is available right now. I'll go back to the first slide and show you guys. That's going to take too long. Yeah, so the deck is available right here. It's on Speaker Deck, and then all the links are there as well. And if you forget this URL, first initial, last name of me, and then abbreviation for WebPagetest. And I'll tweet it as soon as I get off stage, yeah. Anything else? I think we have a break right after this. So I'll be around if you want to come up and ask questions, but thanks for coming.